I am Christopher, and this is Animal Attacks. In this episode, we look at fatal polar bear encounters, from a high Arctic research outpost attack during a routine supply operation to a guided coastal landing where a warning shot failed to stop a charging bear. These cases show how quickly things can turn in polar bear territory. It was September 9th, 2016. The air at the research outpost carried the particular cold of early autumn in the high Arctic, dry and cutting, the kind that moves across open ground without obstruction and finds every gap in clothing within seconds of exposure. The sky was pale and low, the light flat and directionless in the way it gets at that latitude when the season is turning, and the gravel around the storage shed crunched underfoot in the stillness. Lars Henriksen was 38 years old and worked as a logistics supervisor at the outpost, the kind of position built on practical experience rather than formal credentials. Years of coordinating supply runs, managing equipment, and keeping the operational side of remote research work functioning in conditions that would be considered extreme anywhere else. Maya Solberg was 29, a research assistant who had been at the outpost long enough to be comfortable with its rhythms and routines. Thomas Eriksson was 41, the outpost's mechanic, a man whose work kept him outdoors and on the perimeter more than most. The 5 students with them that morning were visiting, newer to the environment, less familiar with its specific requirements. All 8 of them were outside the storage shed that morning, unloading supplies. It was routine work, the kind of task that gets done quickly, with attention divided between the job and the conversation that naturally accompanies it. What was not present that morning, and what standard protocol in polar bear territory explicitly requires, was an armed lookout. One person positioned with visibility across the surrounding terrain, whose sole responsibility is to watch the perimeter while the rest of the group works. The absence of that person was not a dramatic failure. It was the kind of quiet procedural lapse that accumulates in environments where the threat has not materialized recently enough to feel immediate. The protocol exists because the threat is real. It had simply not been treated that way that morning. The protocol was not obscure, it was written down. Someone chose not to enforce it that morning, and I suspect they had chosen not to enforce it on many mornings before that one without consequence. That is how these lapses survive. The polar bear that approached the outpost that morning was a young male, operating in the late summer period before sea ice forms and hunting conditions improve, a phase in which caloric deficit increases risk tolerance and draws animals into proximity with human activity they would otherwise avoid. Polar bears in this state are not indifferent to risk. They are simply willing to accept more of it than a well-fed animal would be. The bear had used the low gravel ridges to the north of the outpost for cover, moving along them in the slow, deliberate way that polar bears move when they are approaching something they intend to investigate at close range. It had stayed downwind of the group, using the inconsistent air to its advantage, which meant those at the shed had no scent-based warning of its approach. By the time it committed to the charge, it had already closed the distance to approximately 25 to 30 meters. At that range, the interval between commitment and contact is measured in seconds. Polar bears stalk quietly and do not commit to an attack from a distance that gives prey time to organize a response. They prioritize a single primary target on initial contact. Secondary injuries in multi-person incidents of this type typically result not from the bear pursuing multiple targets simultaneously, but from the reactions of the people around the primary target. Movement toward the animal, movement across its path, and the general fragmentation of the group that follows the initial strike. The bear charged and targeted Lars first, knocking him to the ground immediately. Most of what followed happened within the first 30 to 60 seconds. Maya moved toward him, a response that drew the bear's attention briefly, and she was struck. The rest of the group scattered, which is a natural response and a dangerous one. Fragmentation in a polar bear encounter removes the only advantage a group of people has over a single large predator, which is the collective size and noise that can, under some circumstances, interrupt the animal's commitment to the attack. A scattered group offers the bear a series of isolated targets rather than a single consolidated presence. In the confusion that followed the initial strikes, one person was knocked over while fleeing. Another was clipped while crossing the bear's path. 2 were injured attempting to pull Lars away from the animal. The bear remained focused around the area of the initial contact, rather than pursuing individuals across the open ground. By this point, it had begun feeding and controlling behavior around Lars, which consolidated its attention rather than dispersing it. This is consistent with documented polar bear attack patterns, in which the animal concentrates its energy around the primary point of engagement, rather than ranging widely after scattered prey. Within approximately 2 minutes of the initial charge, multiple members of the group had sustained injuries of varying severity, some from direct contact with the bear, others from the collisions, falls, and crossing paths that the chaos of the initial strike produced. The bear was shot by an armed responder who had been inside the station when the charge began. The delay was not negligence. Retrieving the weapon, confirming the threat through a window, and crossing the distance to the perimeter all took time. But the outcome of the encounter had been determined not by the speed of that response, but by the absence of the armed lookout, whose job it would have been to see the bear approaching before it reached 25 meters. What strikes me still is how much ground the bear had already covered before anyone knew it was there. By the time the morning became something other than ordinary, the margin for a different outcome had already closed. The next case is a man alone. A tent. A coastline that was exactly as dangerous as it appeared on any map, if you knew how to read one. It was August 14th, 2015. The coastal ridge on the eastern edge of Baffin Island held the particular cold of a clear Arctic night, the kind of cold that settles into the ground after sunset and does not lift until well into the following day. The sky was clear and the light was the flat, ambient gray of an Arctic summer night, not dark, but directionless, without shadow, the kind of light that flattens distance and makes the landscape difficult to read. Stephen Reeves was 34 years old and worked as a wildlife photographer, operating independently and traveling to remote locations to document animals in their natural environments. He was not an inexperienced outdoorsman. The nature of his work required him to move through landscapes that most people never access, to spend extended periods alone in remote terrain, and to manage the practical logistics of that kind of travel without institutional support. He had done it before. He understood, at a working level, the physical demands and the general risks of operating in the high Arctic. What he had underestimated on the night of August 14th was the specific and compounding nature of the risks his campsite location created. Stephen had made camp alone near a known seal zone. Seals are the primary prey of polar bears along this coastline, and the areas where seals are concentrated, by extension, the areas where polar bears are most actively hunting. Camping in proximity to a seal zone is not simply camping in polar bear habitat in a general sense. It is camping inside an active hunting corridor, the specific stretch of coastline that a predator is working through on a regular basis, during the season in which it is most motivated to hunt. The distinction matters, and it had consequences that played out before morning. I understand why he camped there. The seals were the story. The light was right. The location was exactly what his work required. The problem is that his work and his safety required different things that night, and he chose the work. Food had been stored away from the tent, which reflects the basic protocol for camping in bear country. But residual scent from food preparation, from the equipment used to handle food, from the body itself, cannot be fully eliminated from a campsite. Polar bears investigate unfamiliar objects cautiously, and tents are frequently treated as potential food sources before they are identified as shelters containing prey. The investigation often begins before the animal has determined what exactly it is approaching, which means the initial approach can appear non-threatening right up to the moment it is not. The bear that approached Stephen's campsite that night was a large adult male. Large males tend toward directness, less tentative in their investigation than younger animals, more willing to commit quickly once initial uncertainty is resolved. It circled the tent, testing the air at multiple points, but the assessment was brief rather than prolonged. It nudged the fabric from the outside, the kind of physical contact polar bears use to determine whether an object yields, whether it contains something worth pursuing. The movement inside the tent, which was unavoidable once the bear made contact with the exterior, did not register as a warning. It registered as confirmation that something was inside. There was a brief stillness after that, a pause in which the animal's behavior shifted from investigation to intention, and then the engagement that followed was not cautious. The bear tore through the tent fabric and made contact with Stephen at close range. There was no distance to retreat across. There was no interval between the breach and the attack. The confined space and the speed of the escalation left no margin for a defensive response. Whatever deterrents Stephen carried were not immediately accessible. not within reach at the moment the tent was breached. He had deployed nothing during the approach, and he had chosen to camp in a location where the probability of this kind of encounter was higher than anywhere else within range. The next case involves two people who positioned themselves with professional intent in exactly the place a hunting bear would come from. They understood the landscape. They were watching the wrong direction. It was July 2nd, 2017. The coastline near the northern edge of Alaska was caught between seasons that morning. The sea ice had receded further than usual for the time of year, leaving long stretches of open water along the shore, and the air carried the particular cold, wet smell of an Arctic coast in summer, where the temperature is mild enough to keep the ground soft, but cold enough that breath is still visible. Andrew Kent was 45 years old and had been working in field research in Arctic environments for the better part of 2 decades. Jenna Cole was 32 and had joined the project the previous season, working alongside Andrew on coastal wildlife documentation. Both of them were experienced in the practical demands of fieldwork in this environment. They understood the landscape, understood the conditions, and understood, in the abstract, the risks that came with operating in polar bear habitat along an active coastline in summer. What they did not fully account for that morning was the specific risk created by their position relative to the seals they had come to observe. They had positioned themselves at the ice edge to observe a group of seals resting on a remaining ice shelf several meters offshore. Ice edges are primary hunting locations for polar bears during the period when sea ice is retreating. The seals that use the remaining ice for hauling out are concentrated in predictable locations, and polar bears that are hunting in this season know those locations and work them systematically. A researcher positioned at the ice edge to observe seals has, functionally, placed themselves inside the approach corridor that a hunting polar bear would use to reach those same seals. The human presence at that location does not alter the bear's assessment of the area as a viable hunting site. It simply means that when the bear approaches, the humans are already there. This is the part I return to most in this case. They were not careless. They were doing exactly what they came to do, in exactly the right place to do it. The environment did not distinguish between their intentions and their position. The bear had approached from downwind, moving along the ice edge in a way that kept it below the sightline of anyone watching the water, rather than the land behind them. And the pressure hummocks and irregular ice ridges along that edge had broken the sightline further, the bear using that terrain the way it uses any available cover. It closed to under 25 meters before either Andrew or Jenna was aware of its presence. At that range, a polar bear that is committed to a charge covers the distance before a person can process the information and generate a coordinated physical response. The bear charged and targeted Jenna. She had been the first point of scent and visual confirmation as the bear completed its approach. The figure the animal had been tracking for the final stretch of its advance, and the one whose movement registered first at the moment the charge began. Andrew crossed directly into the line of the attack, not simply moving toward Jenna, but entering the space between the bear and its target at the moment the animal was already in committed motion. That physical interruption drew a defensive strike from the bear before it recommitted to the primary target. It was not a sustained redirection, and the bear did not shift its focus cleanly between the two of them. It was a momentary response to an obstruction that had placed itself in its path, followed by a return to the point of initial engagement. The attack resulted in 1 fatality and 1 severe injury. The response team that reached the site was operating out of a forward field station roughly 40 minutes away by all-terrain vehicle across coastal terrain, a realistic interval given the remoteness of the site and the absence of helicopter support that morning. The bear was located and shot after their arrival. The ice edge where the encounter occurred was closed to unsupported fieldwork for the remainder of the season. What Andrew did, stepping into the line of the attack, is the kind of thing that gets called instinct afterward. I don't think instinct is the right word. I think it is what happens when the alternative is something a person cannot accept. It did not save Jenna. It nearly killed him. I record that without judgment. The next case is a man alone on a snowmobile in March, in the interior, when the machine stopped working and the afternoon began moving toward dark. It was March 11th, 2014. The interior of the archipelago in midwinter carries a cold that is categorically different from what most people mean when they use that word. Not the cold of a sharp morning or an exposed hillside, but a sustained, structural cold that settles into the landscape completely and makes the air itself feel dense and close. The light at that time of year is limited to a narrow window in the middle of the day, and by the time Eric Nielsen's snowmobile had stopped responding, that window had already begun to close. Eric Nielsen was 27 years old, and he had been traveling a standard interior route between two outpost stations, the kind of transit that experienced snowmobile operators in the archipelago make regularly, following established paths across terrain that is well mapped and generally predictable in its conditions. He was not a novice. He had made this kind of journey before, carried the standard equipment for travel in polar bear territory, and understood the general protocols for operating in the environment. What he had not fully prepared for was the specific vulnerability that a mechanical breakdown creates. The transformation from a moving, noisy, machine-associated presence that polar bears typically avoid into a stationary, isolated figure in open terrain, exposed and not going anywhere. The breakdown was not dramatic. The snowmobile stopped responding, and Eric moved into the standard mechanical troubleshooting sequence, assessing the problem, working through the steps to identify and, if possible, fix the cause. It was the practical, focused work of someone trying to solve a problem, and that focus was part of what created the secondary problem. Polar bears investigate stationary and isolated figures in open terrain. The behavior is not exclusively predatory in its initial phase. It is investigatory, driven by the same curiosity that leads polar bears to approach unfamiliar objects of any kind in their environment. But that investigatory behavior does not resolve cleanly into one outcome or another. It escalates in stages. A polar bear in the energy deficit conditions of late winter that encounters a stationary object offering no deterrent and no response does not make a discrete decision to shift from curiosity to predation. It simply continues to close distance. Each increment of that approach that goes unanswered narrows the window in which the encounter can still be interrupted until the animal's proximity and behavioral state have moved past the threshold where noise or deterrent would be likely to reverse its course. He had the deterrent. It was in his kit. The kit was on the snowmobile. His hands were on the engine. The bear had approached from behind terrain cover, the pressure ridges and surface irregularities that provide concealment across what appears, from a distance, to be flat open ground. Eric had not seen it before. It had already closed a significant portion of the distance between them. When he became aware of the animal, it had stopped at roughly 40 to 50 meters and was assessing the situation, still outside committed charge range, but well within the zone where a stationary, unresponsive human presence would continue to invite approach. The brief, motionless pause that precedes either retreat or escalation in a polar bear that has not yet committed to either is not a long one. The correct response at that moment is to create distance, to make noise, to use whatever deterrent is available, and to do all of it immediately and decisively. The window in which those actions can interrupt the bear's continued approach is not wide, and it closes faster than most people expect. Eric's attention remained primarily on the snowmobile. He was close to a solution, or believed he was, and the competing priority of restarting the vehicle before the light failed and the temperature continued to drop was real and immediate. He was not scanning. His movement was minimal and task-focused, exactly the profile that allows a polar bear's approach to go unregistered until the distance has already closed, past the point where a response would be effective. He did not create distance. He did not deploy a deterrent. The bear closed the remaining gap in the time it took Eric to register that the animal had moved from assessment to approach, and the attack that followed was fatal. The snowmobile was found the following morning by a search team dispatched from the nearer of the two stations when Eric failed to arrive. Wildlife officers located the bear in the vicinity and, assessing it as an ongoing threat to the search team and the travel corridor, dispatched it on site. 40 to 50 meters. A pause. A window that did not get used. I keep returning to that pause in all of these cases. The moment where the shape of what happens next is still, technically, undecided. It is a feature of the record that I have not been able to set aside. The next case takes place in a town, not wilderness. A place with roads and houses and a bear that had been seen before, documented, flagged, and not yet removed. It was November 3rd, 2018. The town of Churchill in northern Manitoba sits at the edge of a landscape that transitions between boreal forest and tundra in the weeks either side of freeze-up, a period when the bears that have spent the summer and autumn on land, waiting for the sea ice to form, are at their most mobile and most active along the coastline and its surrounding area. Sarah Whitmore was 51 years old and had lived in the region for most of her adult life. She was not someone unfamiliar with polar bears. Living in this part of northern Manitoba means living with the annual presence of the animals in a way that most people in most places never experience. Bears moving through the town's outskirts during the autumn staging period. Bear alerts issued through local communication channels. The general awareness that the period around freeze-up requires different habits and different levels of attention outdoors than the rest of the year. Sarah understood all of this. The knowledge had not, on the evening of November 3rd, translated into the specific behavioral adjustment that the situation required. She was walking alone on the outskirts of the town, in an area where garbage had accumulated near a collection point. Food-conditioned polar bears, animals that have learned to associate human settlement with accessible food, operate differently from bears that have had no such exposure. The wariness that governs most polar bear behavior around humans is reduced or absent in food-conditioned individuals. They approach human-associated areas with less hesitation, investigate at closer range, and engage with human figures. They encounter near food sources with a directness that wild bears, moving through settled areas, do not typically display. The bear that approached Sarah that evening had been documented near the garbage area on multiple prior occasions. Its behavior pattern had been noted. It had not yet been captured and relocated because the resources required to do so had not been deployed in time. I have tried to find out exactly who made that decision and when. I have not been able to. That is its own kind of answer. The bear spotted Sarah from a moderate distance and oriented toward her. A brief pause, a scanning of the area, before beginning its approach. The hesitation that might govern a first encounter between a polar bear and a human near a food source was present, but compressed. Its threshold had been worn down by prior exposure. What followed was not the slow, cautious investigation of an animal encountering something unfamiliar, but the more purposeful movement of one that had already revised its expectations of what humans near this area represented. The remaining distance closed quickly, and without the kind of behavioral signaling that might have allowed Sarah to create separation before contact. It was a rapid approach, culminating in contact, rather than a discrete charge with a clear initiation point. The kind of encounter that field teams in Churchill document as among the most difficult to interrupt early, because the behavioral cues that precede it are subtle and the acceleration is abrupt. A response team was dispatched when Sarah failed to return, but the outskirts of the town in the fading light of a November evening are not a small area to search, and the interval between her leaving and the team reaching the collection point was long enough that sustained predation behavior had already developed before anyone arrived. Sarah did not survive. The bear was located and captured the following day. The garbage collection point was closed and relocated the following season. What I keep returning to in this case is not the bear's behavior. That was documented, predictable, the logical extension of what food conditioning produces. It is the gap between the record and the response. The final case involves a group, a guide, and 6 tourists on a coastal landing, a warning shot that did not hold, and a man on the ground who did not get up. It was June 18th, 2016. The coastal landing site on the western edge of the archipelago was exposed and flat, the kind of terrain that offers no natural shelter from the wind that moves in off the water in summer. Steady and cold despite the season, carrying the smell of ice and open ocean. The sky that morning was overcast, but high, the light diffuse and even, the kind of conditions that experienced guides in this part of the world know can change quickly. Henrik Dahl was 44 years old and had been working as a guide in the archipelago for over a decade, leading tourist excursions to coastal landing sites where wildlife could be observed in a landscape that most visitors to the region never see from the ground. He was experienced, licensed, armed, as required by the regulations governing guided activity in polar bear habitat, and familiar with the specific requirements of managing groups of people in an environment where polar bear encounters are not hypothetical. The tourists with him that morning were 6 people of varying ages and varying levels of experience in wilderness environments. None of them were in the archipelago professionally, and none of them had the trained situational awareness that working in this landscape requires. The procedural failure that morning was not in the equipment or the formal preparation. It was in the deployment of the group on the landing site. Tight formation discipline, keeping the group consolidated, with the guide positioned to maintain sightlines in all directions, and the group close enough together to present a collective presence rather than a series of isolated individuals, is the basic operational protocol for landing groups in polar bear habitat. The group had spread out across the landing site in the way that tourist groups naturally do when they arrive somewhere new and interesting, and the guide's attention had been distributed across managing the landing logistics rather than concentrated on the perimeter. Henrik knew the protocol. I do not doubt that. What I think happened is what happens in every group scenario in this record. The logistics of the moment crowded out the vigilance the moment required. You cannot fully manage an arrival and fully watch a perimeter at the same time, and he was one person. The bear was spotted late. At approximately 60 meters, it had already closed a significant portion of the distance from the terrain to the north of the landing site, moving with the low, ground-covering pace that polar bears use when approaching across open ground. Not the committed acceleration of a charge, but the steady, purposeful closing of distance that precedes one. Henrik fired a warning shot. The bear paused. It assessed. In the majority of encounters, a warning shot at that range is sufficient to redirect a bear that has not yet fully committed. This bear had already passed the threshold at which a warning shot reliably interrupts. Behaviorally committed, underfed, and close enough that the pause lasted only a few seconds before it resumed its approach. The group began to retreat toward the water, but the retreat was uneven. In a group of 7 people on open ground, the pace of retreat is determined by the slowest individual, and a disorganized retreat across uneven coastal terrain produces exactly the kind of fragmentation and unpredictable movement that makes managing a bear encounter significantly harder. One tourist tripped on the uneven ground and went down. The bear's attention moved toward the movement. Henrik repositioned and fired a second round, this time closer to the animal, but the distance had already collapsed below the range at which deterrence reliably functions, and the bear did not redirect. An underfed bear at close range that has already committed to a target does not reliably respond to a warning shot that is not a killing shot, and Henrik's angle of fire across the retreat path of a scattered group constrained what he could do without endangering the others. By the time he had a clear line, the bear had already made contact with the fallen tourist. Henrik shot the animal at close range, and it went down. The tourist did not survive. The group was recovered to the vessel. The landing site was closed for the remainder of the excursion season, and the operational protocols for formation discipline during shore landings were revised across the region in the months that followed.